Hello, everyone. This is Sydney Kraviak from Peters Township Public Library. Thank you for joining us this evening for our author Walter Meyer Experiencing Life as an Adventure. This program is being recorded and everyone's mic is muted and your camera is off. In the meantime, please feel free to use the chat feature and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask your questions as they come up. So Walter G. Meyer was born and raised in Bethel Park. He is the or ghost writer of 6 nonfiction books, including The Respectful Leader, an Amazon best-selling and Axiom award-winning business fable. His critically acclaimed and award-winning and Amazon best-selling novel, Rounding Third, deals powerfully with the topic of teens being bullied. His subsequent presentation, Accept and Respect, The Keys to Ending Bullying, has been shared with colleges, high schools, and corporations across the country. He has been on radio and television programs, including NPR, and has spoken at colleges, libraries, and community centers across the country. Mr. Meyer's articles have appeared in Kiplinger's Personal Finance, the Los Angeles Times, Orange County Register, Westways, Baja Explorer, Out, the Pittsburgh Gazette, and dozens of other magazines and newspapers. He is the co-author of a widely produced stage play, Gamers, which led him to co-creating GamerCon, a gaming convention built around the play. Several of his screenplays have been optioned, but never quite made into movies. Just yet. To support his writing habit over the years, he has worked a variety of jobs, some of which are chronicled in his blogs. He began writing his blogs during the COVID quarantine, publishing them one story at a time on Facebook to entertain himself and his friends and followers. Mr. Meyer has a degree from the School of Communications at Penn State and currently resides in San Diego. This evening, Mr. Meyer is going to be sharing some stories from his most recent book with us.
Well, thank you, Sydney, and thank you to the Peters Township Library staff for setting this up. I appreciate it, and thank you all for joining us. It's fun to see some people I haven't seen in a very long time, and see some relatives and old friends, and see some unfamiliar names. So we have a nice mix of people here. Even those of you who know me well have probably never heard some of these stories because it has been an interesting life. This book came about, like so many things in my life, quite by accident. I wrote a comment on a friend's Facebook post about my brief interaction with Charlton Heston, which led to a story about the time I met Shirley Jones, which led to another story and another story. And as Sydney explained, I told these stories to entertain us during the lockdown. The photo at left is of me emceeing an event at the world famous Friars Club in Beverly Hills, which is something I also fell into pretty much by accident. I had never done anything like that before, but I got hired to MC this event. And it's a terrible picture, I know, which is why it isn't in the book, but they only took 2 pictures of me that night. I wasn't the lead act. So I didn't use that, but I did have to catch up with this woman afterwards. That's Shirley Jones of the Partridge Family, who is from Smithton, Pennsylvania, if you didn't know. And I had to tell her that I actually had heard her sing at the Allegheny County Fair in South Park when I was about 5 years old. So very gracious lady. The story of Shirley Jones led to another celebrity encounter story with this gentleman, Richard Burton. Before everybody had a cell phone in their pocket, of course, you couldn't take selfies, and it would have been a bit tacky to bring a real camera into work to get a picture of me with Richard Burton. But he used to come into the bookstore where I worked in Beverly Hills quite often. He was living in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, so we actually got to know each other fairly well. This is a mural in Hollywood, which was the only picture I had of Richard Burton, is this of him with his twice wife, Elizabeth Taylor. And the bookstore led to another interesting incident, which I chronicle in the book, the night we accidentally did Taming of the Shrew in the bookstore at Christmas time. It's too long a story to tell here today, but you can read that one in the book. Unfortunately, one of the great Shakespearean actors of our day, Richard Burton, was not there to participate in that. The title of the book, If You Weren't Here, This Would Not Be Happening, comes from the time I got caught in a shootout in Washington, D.C. I was visiting a friend. We're sitting at a traffic light. A guy comes running out of the liquor store at the corner and is getting shot at by the owner of the liquor store. The bad guy is shooting back at the liquor store owner. DC police roll up on the other side of the intersection and get him in a crossfire. And all we can do is fall to the floor of the car and cover our heads. And my friend said to me, if you weren't here, this would not be happening. Anybody who knows me knows bizarre things tend to happen when I'm around. And so it's just become a theme of my life that weird things happen. Not all the photos and stories I'm sharing with you today are in the book. Many are, but I have enough stories to produce at least 4 more volumes. So if things go well, there'll be many more stories to come. In addition to having adventures just happen to me, like the shootout in DC, I have gone out of my way to try to have adventures. When I was in high school at Bethel Park High School, I forged a hall pass myself and skipped school to go downtown to watch one of the Steeler victory parades. I talked my father into getting up at an ungodly hour on a Sunday morning to watch the Carlton House Hotel be imploded from his office of the 26th story of the Mellon Bank building. I'll never forget the look on the security guard's face when he asked my father what he was doing signing us into the bank at that hour. And my father calmly replied, "Oh, we're just here to watch the building blow up." I tried to participate in other pieces of history. A little town of Hermitage, Pennsylvania, about an hour north of Pittsburgh, started putting up flags during the Iranian hostage crisis, eventually up to 444 flags. This is 440 right there. I couldn't find the higher numbers, but I drove up there several times in the summer and in the winter to photograph the accumulation of flags. It wasn't long after I moved to LA that Hands Across America happened. And some of you who are a bit older may remember this guy's idea to get everybody joining hands from coast to coast. And our part of the line here in Marina del Rey is the part that touched the Pacific Ocean. So that was kind of cool to be a part of that. So I have, gone out of my way to try to do exciting things. In search of adventure, I have driven across the United States 3 times. 43 states so far. I do want to complete the set, and including an initial 6-week drive to California that took me from Pittsburgh to California. And among the stops along the way was the world famous Garden of Eden in Lucas, Kansas. And this is just a couple of shots of that, but it is my nominee for the most bizarre tourist attraction in the country. A Civil War veteran, when he was 80 some years old, decided to start telling Bible stories in reinforced concrete on his farm in Lucas, Kansas. It's well worth the drive a couple hundred miles north of I-70 to see his wonderful artwork. And then he built himself a concrete sarcophagus with a glass lid, so you can actually see Mr. Dinsmore under glass many decades after his death. On my drive across the United States, I had to pay homage to one of my favorite writers, Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle spent most of the 1920s and 30s driving around the United States and writing whatever he felt like writing for a newspaper for which he worked. He was killed during World War II, covering the war in the Pacific, and his home in Albuquerque, New Mexico is now a library and memorial to him. I also loved Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck and about his drive across the United States, and a book by a guy named William Least Heat Moon, a Native American, wrote about his travels across the United States called Blue Highways. And inspired by him, I decided when I drive across the United States, if I have time, to avoid the interstates. On the map that he used, the interstates were in red, the back roads were in blue, and he wanted to stick to the blue highways. Because Maine looks a lot like Kansas from the interstate, but if you get off the interstate, you can definitely tell the difference. And in places like New Mexico, you see burros walking down the street. And this is a shot of Marble Canyon, Arizona. And I tell the story of greeting the sunrise in Marble Canyon near the Grand Canyon one morning. One of the things I like to do as I travel around is to definitely try to make time to stop and smell the roses, and to take pictures of weird signs. I have a huge collection of weird signs. This is one of my favorites. This is from up the Allegheny River. I like to refer to it as the exit sign, formerly known as Prince. You remember the singer for a while used a weird glyph instead of his name, but good luck trying to find the exit to Arnold, PA at 55 miles an hour by looking at this sign. My all-time favorite sign for my travels is from New Cayuma, California, which is in the hills north of Santa Barbara. And I drove by this sign, and a mile or so later, I was still trying to digest it. Like, wait, did they really? No, they could. So I went back and take a picture of this sign. You have to love a small town with a weird sense of humor. When I got to LA, I actually moved to LA to tell screenplays, so I dabbled in Hollywood and did work for a TV show and on a few low-budget movies, not as a writer, but in other roles. That's me, believe it or not. That is me in front of the Hollywood sign. And I happened to get an apartment in Venice, California, that it's only half a block from the beach, but by whatever quirk of geography, I could actually see the Hollywood sign from my living room window. With a binoculars or telephoto lens, I could see the Hollywood sign. So that helped inspire me and remind me why I moved to LA. One of the first things I had to do when I got to LA was try out for Jeopardy. I used to watch it sitting at the foot of my grandmother's bed in Bethel Park. And I tried out, I passed the written test, didn't pass the play for the producers test. Again, same thing, passed the written test, didn't pass the play for the producers test. And I realized I had a problem. I was very shy and bumbling and didn't do well. And the times I got in to pitch one of my screenplays to some Hollywood producer, I'm thinking, this sounds bad to me, and I wrote it and I like it. What must they be thinking? Because I was so bad at this. So I decided to take an acting class at Santa Monica College. And the teacher said he was going to try out for Jeopardy. And I said, oh, yeah, I did that. It didn't work. And he goes, well, come with me. You'll be able to hold my hand and keep me calm, and I'll be too nervous. And I said, no, I tried out twice. I'm not, please, I'll give you an A in the class. And I said, I don't care about the A in the class. I already have a degree. I'm not here for that. And he said, I'll buy you lunch. Please come with me. So I went with him. I passed the written test. He did not. And then when it came time to play for the producers, I was just being all goofy and glib and everything because I knew they weren't going to pick me, but they did because that's what they wanted. So as the headline from the Pittsburgh Press here, I did this article with Pittsburgh Press, 2 out of 3 isn't bad, implies I came in second, which means I got the Lee Press on Nails, the year's supply of minute rice, the trip to New York, but you don't get any of the cash unless you actually win. But I did, of course, get to meet Alex Trebek. One of the other interesting things I did when I moved to LA was a friend of a friend from Penn State asked me to go with her to the Rudolph Valentino Memorial at Hollywood Memorial Park. Every year since Valentino died in 1926, they have held a memorial service for him there. Now, when it was, when he was freshly dead, it was a real memorial service. People who knew him came and grieved. But when I went, it was almost 60 years after the fact. So there was nobody around who really remembered him. And it was hard to take the grieving very seriously for someone you didn't know who had been dead for decades. So it became sort of bizarre performance art. And in the early days, they had people come who actually knew Valentino, who had worked on his movies or been friends of his. But now they were stretching things so much that the year I went, their guest featured speaker was a guy whose great uncle once played the organ in a movie house that once showed a Valentino film. So it really had become a bizarre parody of a memorial service. And even though it was this weird parody, you feel weird about giggling in a chapel, the chapel there at the cemetery. So my friend and I decided to go outside and try to get the giggles out of us, because you know how it is, if you start laughing at a church, the more you try to stop, the worse it gets. So we went out, we found this bench overlooking the pond, and we were sitting on it, and this woman came up to us and said, Tyrone Power's grave is lovely, isn't it? And we said, what do you mean? She said, you're sitting on it. And we jumped up, and sure enough, what we thought was a bench is Tyrone Power's gravestone. On top is etched the quote from Hamlet, good night, sweet prince, and flocks of angels speed thee to thy rest. And we were all apologetic. And she said, no, I'm sure he meant it as a bench. I'm sure this is, was intended this way. And she said, I went to his funeral. And I said, you knew Tyrone Power? And she said, no, I just go to movie stars' funerals. I've been doing it for years. And clearly she had, because Tyrone Power died in 1958, and we're now, almost 30 years later. And she started giving us critiques of celebrity funerals. She was still offended at Chico Marx's funeral because Groucho and Harpo and the rest of the Marx brothers kept cutting up and misbehaving, as she said, and just made a mockery of the whole thing. And she thought it was disgraceful. And I'm thinking, who are you to judge how the Marx brothers should grieve their dead brother? The Marx brothers made a good living as zany comics. I would have thought this is the send-off Chico would have wanted, but it's not up to either of us to judge how his brothers are supposed to mourn him. But then it got really weird when she told us she went to Bing Crosby's funeral. She said they buried Bing Crosby in the middle of the night in an undisclosed location because they wanted to be a private family affair. And she said, but I found out where it was and I went anyway. And I said, wait, you crashed Bing Crosby's funeral? And she said, yes, I didn't think it was right. I thought his pan should be there. So now we had lapsed from a bizarre hobby into completely crazy. So we went back inside where at least the memorial service was a little more sane crazy. But I never went back to the Valentino memorial service. I did take lots of flying adventures over the years. One of my friends who's on here is in this photo. This is a plane he rented at the Van Nuys Airport. That's me next to it. And we used to go on lots of fun flying adventures. And over the years and all of my travels, I had taken over 20,000 slides and I got about 9,000 of them scanned. And I was actually really good about labeling my slides most of the time with a date, location, who's in them. But I found this whole set of this seaplane on a lake that I take to be Northern California. And I have no recollection of this whatsoever. So I sent the pictures to Rick and said, do you know where this is? Do you remember who these people are or why we're there? I do know this guy, but I don't know this guy or this guy. And he has no recollection either, which I think is kind of funny because it's also kind of fun that we were taking so many adventures back then. We can't even remember this one. Another adventure I don't remember is I found a set of photos from me in Joshua Tree National Park. That's my four-wheel drive. That's me with my then roommate, Carl. That's me. And I have no recollection of this trip at all. So I sent some of these photos to Carl and said, do you remember this trip? And he goes, oh yeah, it was great. It was it was the best time I ever had. It's like, okay, so the trip really happened, but it's crazy to me that I have such a good memory for certain things and other trips are completely blurred to me. But it's handy to know people with airplanes and know people with sailboats. You get to have a lot of fun adventures that way. I met a guy who had a biplane, and somewhere on my bucket list was the goal to someday fly in an open cockpit biplane. And most pilots at some point have worn out their family and friends taking them flying. So when I said I'd like to go up, he said yes, because they like to show off, but not to people who are bored and falling asleep. So I actually got to fly the biplane. That's me at the controls there. And it had a stick, not a yoke, just a stick where you just barely touched it and you could maneuver the biplane. That's me in my helmet and goggles. That's me with the plane. And so I finally got to cross that off my bucket list and fulfill my desire to pretend I was the Red Baron, or at least Snoopy. So that was a lot of fun. One of the first things I wanted to do when I got to California was go to Yosemite National Park. And stupidly, I thought since it's full summer in April in Southern California, it would be summer in Yosemite in the high Sierras. Bad mistake. When I very, very snowy, and only 3 of us were stupid enough to be camped in the Yosemite Valley in the snow. It was warm enough during the day to rain all day, and then it would snow all night. And these 2 other guys and I kind of latched onto each other and started hiking together. And on about our 4th day of walking in the teeming rain, which never let up except to snow, the one guy who was a police officer in Germany said to me, and the other guy from California, they tell me you have a song. It never rains in California. Why is this song? It does nothing but rain here. But we had to tell him the next lyric of that song is, but it pours, man, it pours. And man, it did pour. I actually thought I had pneumonia when I got back from that trip because I did not have winter camping gear. It was very cold. One of the other adventures was going to Sequoia National Park. And that was interesting because there was still a ton of snow in places, but it was melted in other places and it was 80 degrees. And with one of my Penn State friends, I went there and we actually went hiking in the snow shirtless. It was like, spring skiing where it's 80 degrees, but we had a snowball battle shirtless because it was that warm. And then we got lost in the woods. I thought I knew the trail. Somehow we missed the trail and ended up having to hike all night on a moonless night in the darkness, getting more and more lost in the woods. And we got stalked by a bear. And it became the base for a screenplay that I wrote called My Hike with Doughboy that I hope will get made one of these days. But obviously that was a close call. And so I decided if I was going to keep having trips like this, I needed a more robust vehicle. So I bought a 4-wheel drive, and another Penn State friend, this guy, came out to see Penn State in the Rose Bowl. There's the Nittany Lion logo in the end zone. And we had to go to the Rose Parade. And then I wanted to show off my new SUV. So we went out near Death Valley, the other side of the High Sierras, and went kind of off-roading, and I got us stuck in the snow. I thought I was kind of invincible. I was wrong. And the only tool with which we had to shovel the vehicle out was a Frisbee, which is what he is doing here. It took us hours to shovel the car out. But this is pre-cell phone days. Would have had a 12 or 15 mile hike to get help. So we decided the better option was to try to dig our way out, which we did. But sometimes my adventures are due, I will admit, to dumb choices on my part. Another great adventure I got to have that was on my bucket list was getting to ride a Zamboni. There I am at a San Diego Gulls game, their minor league hockey team. And, you know, ever since my first Penguin game when I was maybe 5 years old, I wanted to ride a Zamboni. I mean, who doesn't? And so I used my press credentials to get to ride a Zamboni and write about it. And I got to tell you, it's actually kind of boring. It's really more interesting to watch from the stands because after about 30 seconds, you're like, well, this is a boring route. We're just going in circles. Luckily, this guy, who was their longtime Zamboni driver, had a bunch of great stories and kept me entertained. I'm really glad I did it. I would certainly do it again, but it was like, if I never get to do it again, that's okay. It really wasn't, you know. But I've written for lots of the local press, Pittsburgher Magazine, Pittsburgh Press, Penn Stater. For Pittsburgh Magazine, I've written several stories. One was about this guy I went to high school with who was a world champion bird carver. And I wrote a piece about the interesting football history of Washington and Jefferson that unfortunately I don't have a paper copy of it, only an online copy. But Washington and Jefferson, if you didn't know, actually has a fascinating football history. They were the first team to put numbers on their jerseys. John Heisman once played at Washington and Jefferson. They played in the Rose Bowl. So there's a really fascinating history of Washington and Jefferson football that I covered for Pittsburgh Magazine. I've written for all sorts of other magazines on all sorts of other topics, including baseball for San Diego Magazine, pawn shops for Orange Coast Magazine. And this was kind of fun for me. For a British magazine called And, I wrote about this British musician, and it ended up being their cover story, which ended up on billboards all over England, which I thought was cool. I mean, I know we're all entitled to our 15 minutes of fame. I didn't know mine was going to be in England, but it was still nice that a story that I wrote was featured all over the UK. I also got to interview Vernon Law, not for Sports Illustrated. No, it was for a baseball website. But I happened to be in Pittsburgh visiting my parents when the interview came up. So I told them I would like to go in the other room and close the door for the interview. And they asked who I was interviewing. And I said Vern Law. And it was fun to watch my parents, my father become a jealous 6-year-old, like, wait, how come you get interviewed, Vern Law? I want to talk to Vern Law. Because anybody who followed the Pirates in the 60s had to like be in awe of Vern Law. He told me great stories about the 1960 World Series, about once pitching a 24-inning game, about being perhaps the only man in the history of baseball to get thrown out of a baseball game for not swearing at the umpire. So that was a lot of fun interviewing Vern. Turns out we have friends in common. And when I went to Cooperstown, finally made it to the Baseball Hall of Fame, I had to visit the Hannes Wagner Shrine there. He was one of the first 5 men inducted into Cooperstown. And my father worked at Mellon Bank for years with Virginia Wagner, Hannes's daughter. So I had heard stories from him about her dad. So I was really, happy to see how well he is represented at Cooperstown. And then on the cover of the book here, I feature ticket stubs from 2 of the games of the 1960 World Series, Game 1 and Game 7. These ticket stubs belong to my great uncle and aunt who went to the game. And they wanted my grandmother, who's even a bigger Pirate fan than they were, to go with them. And she said no, she would never be able to handle the excitement if the Pirates won. And she couldn't. Listening to the game at home, when Bill Mazeroski hit his famous home run, she had a heart attack. That's how seriously she took Pirate baseball. But I have a number of other, fun baseball stories in there, including my father, my uncle, and my godfather all happened to be at the game at Forbes Field when Babe Ruth hit his last 3 home runs of his career. So a lot of baseball history. I've written books for other people, including I saw Jordan Goldrich sign in. I wrote this book with him, wrote several other books with and for people. And I wrote a novel, Rounding Third, set on a high school baseball team in Ohio that it's about 2 kids getting bullied on their baseball team that happened to be published just before the bullying crisis started making the news. So as Sydney mentioned at the beginning, I've been on numerous radio stations, spoke at West Virginia University, University of Pittsburgh, Johnstown, Penn State, lots of other places. And this I thought was interesting. That is the front page of the Jamestown, New York paper. Apparently not much has happened in Jamestown since Lucille Ball left. Everything in town is named for Lucy. She is buried there. It's a big deal there. But apparently having a writer come from California is the most news they've had in a while, because I was front page news, which I actually thought was kind of funny. I wrote for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette a story called 6 Degrees from Gettysburg about all of the Gettysburg connections I was unearthing. I do a lot of writing here in San Diego at a coffee shop owned by a guy who since has become a friend. And I was working on, I have a novel outline about the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. And he asked me one day what I was working on. I told him, and he said, "Oh, is my great-great-grandfather going to be in your novel about Gettysburg?" And I said, "Why would he be?" And he said, "My great-great-grandfather was General Winfield Scott Hancock, who was one of the top Union commanders at Gettysburg." I found this interesting because this statue here is of General Alexander Hayes. My father worked for years at Mellon Bank with Alexander Hayes IV, and that is his great-great-grandfather, whose commanding officer was General Winfield Scott Hancock. Then I found out that my parents' parish priest at St. Thomas More at the time, a guy named Joe Cadori, if you've been to Gettysburg, one of the landmarks in the middle of the battlefield is the Cadori farm. That is his family. Hayes and Hancock wanted to burn that farm as they had burned others that were obstructing their field of fire, but they didn't get around to burning it before Pickett's charge started, so the Cadori farm still stands there. So I thought it was interesting that I knew people who, all intersected there, and I called it 6 Degrees from Gettysburg because I managed to tie Kevin Bacon into it, of course. Sydney was telling me that the Peters Township Library is doing a walking tour of the plaques of South Park. And this is a picture I had taken of one of those plaques years ago that is gone now because it was one of the pillars outside the Corrigan Drive pool, which is long gone. But I thought it was interesting. This is dedicated to General Alexander Hayes, although they misspelled Hayes, they gave him an E, which he did not have. My connection is this gentleman. My great-great-grandfather was at the Battle of Gettysburg. I can't really say in the Battle of Gettysburg because his regiment was guarding the supply train a few miles down the road. So not really in the battle, but he was there. And this picture is of General G.K. Warren, which is on Little Round Top. Years ago, to go to southern Mexico, I had to get malaria shots and a bunch of other pills for diseases I might encounter in the jungles down there. And they weren't readily available at doctor's offices in LA, so I had to go to some special doctor. And while I was waiting for him, I saw he had a picture very similar to this on his wall. And when he came in to give me the shots, I said to him, "Is there any particular reason you have a picture of General G.K. Warren on your wall?" And he said, "I've had that picture there for over 20 years, and no one has ever recognized that as G.K. Warren. But yes, that's my great-great-grandfather." So again, these people just keep tripping over each other, and everybody seems to have a path to Gettysburg. Richard Nixon's great-grandfather was killed at Gettysburg. So a lot of connections there. I often was in the right place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time. I went to the 1984 Olympics. That's me at the opening ceremonies wearing a Great Race t-shirt. I used to run the Great Race when I lived in Pittsburgh. And if anybody remembers the 1984 Olympics, they probably remember one of the biggest stories of that games was when Mary Decker, this woman, fell. That's her walking into the stadium. That's how close we were to the action when it happened. The race was to go right by here, and she fell right about there. I was so stunned by what happened, I didn't take a picture. Stupid me. Why do you have a camera if you're not going to take pictures? But at the time, as Mary fell, she pointed to a South African runner named Zola Budd and accused Budd of tripping her. Well, Budd was disqualified, and every time she would come back around the track, we would boo her heartily. And then they reviewed the films and found that Mary Decker tripped herself. No one touched her. Budd was reinstated. But now we felt bad. How do you retract a boo? But, she hadn't done anything wrong. I found it interesting. A couple of years ago, I saw an article that listed the greatest sports villains of all time. And one of the people on that list was Zola Budd for tripping Mary Decker. And I thought, wow, how do we keep history from going so astray? Within 45 minutes, Zola Budd was exonerated, and yet here we are, 30 some years later, and she's still getting blamed. It was great living in LA at the time. That's the apartment building I was living in Venice at the time. And this is the women's marathon. That's the lead American runner coming by. Both the men's and women's marathon went right down my street. So it was great living there because you didn't even have to go far from your front door to actually be able to see parts of the Olympics. One other case of being in the right or wrong place at the right time. When the World Cup was played at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, I went to several of the games and was at one of the most infamous games in World Cup history, the game in which this gentleman, Andres Escobar of Colombia, accidentally scored on his own team. This right there, that own goal cost Colombia the match. It ended up 2-1. The Colombians who were sitting behind us in the Rose Bowl freaked out when this happened and said, oh, geez, he can't go home. He can never go home. They will kill him. They'll kill him. They can't. And they are freaked out. And my friend and I were thinking, they won't really kill him. I mean, you're at a baseball game, you say, kill the umpire. You don't really mean you're going to stick around after the game and kill the umpire. Well, in Colombia, they take their football very seriously. Andres Escobar was home less than a week when he was shot and killed. He paid the ultimate price for that mistake. I lived through the LA riots. And these are a few photos that, again, wrong place, wrong time. I was a long write-up of that in the book where I talk about living through the riots and then flying out with my friend Rick after curfew one night, which made for an interesting trek home. But it was part of the reason I moved from LA to San Diego, in that it's hard to look at your city the same after you've watched parts of your neighborhood burn. And we actually had National Guard stationed in our block for a while, which kind of taints your view of the world for a while. For years, to support my writing habit, I taught comedy traffic school. In California, they have this thing that if you get a traffic ticket, you can get it expunged from your record by doing 8 hours of penance and being re-educated in the laws of the state of California. It being LA, I taught celebrities like Jackson Browne and Whitney Houston traffic school, but it was often the classes of just average people, because it was such an interesting conglomeration of people, all walks of life, all strata of society, getting thrown together just by the randomness of getting tickets. And I tell several of these stories in the book, but I could easily do a whole volume just of traffic school stories. But one I tell in there that still gets me a little choked up to this day is that there was a young man from Botswana who was a medical student at UCLA who told us that he was giving up on medical school, that LA was such a big, heartless city that he was giving up and going home to Botswana. And my class was so nice to him, was so supportive, took up a collection for him. And he was, at the end of class, said he was going to try to stick it out and finish medical school. So I get a little choked up to think that a village in Botswana may have a doctor thanks to me and my students. So there were magical moments like that. And there's a few others of those in the book as well. One of the adventures I got to take was to write articles about endangered sea turtles in the Mexican state of Michoacan in southern Mexico. And one of those lucky things, right place, right time, leatherback turtles only nest at night. So the pictures tend to be pretty bad and pretty dark, except while I was there, a turtle came out to nest in the daytime. Some of these scientists had worked there for years and years and never seen a turtle in daylight. But I was lucky enough to get lots of really clear daylight pictures of a turtle. And every time I wrote an article about this and daylight turtle pictures were in the article, I would get contacted by people wanting the rights to those photos. So other books, magazines, a calendar, even the Smithsonian contacted me about wanting rights to some of my photos, which was amazing. And again, just luck of the draw. The turtles are endangered because poachers steal their eggs and sell them in bars in Mexico. Back then, the going price for an egg was $1. When most people in that area made $60 a month, making an extra dollar was a huge difference in their income. So they would try to get to the turtles and steal their eggs and sell them. So the volunteers working with the Mexican scientists would try to get to the eggs first. And what this guy is doing is fishing out the eggs. There's one right there. They're the size of a cue ball. And this woman is putting them in a bag, and we would take them and put them in reburied them in a compound guarded by the Mexican Navy in this, barbed wire compound, and try to protect them from the poachers. Then when I got back to the States, I got to write pretty much the same story for lots of different newspapers. About this gentleman, I wrote for the Pittsburgh Press, retired Pittsburgh principal saves turtles. For this gentleman, I wrote for the Orange County Register, local photographer saves turtles. For the Portland Oregonian, it was local printer saves turtles. So it worked out well for me. I just got different quotes from each of the people, had to make sure I had pictures of each of the people, and then could just tell the story over and over again. So it was a win. I got a free vacation. I got paid for writing the articles, and people became aware of the problem with the endangered turtles. The poachers took this very seriously, and one night while we're out on turtle patrol, they set fire to our camp. Luckily, the rancher whose property we were camping on and his sons were able to put out the fire before it got out of hand, but it was a little scary at times. So the next day, some of the scientists went off with some of the Mexican Navy guys in search of the poachers. Well, the Mexican Navy guys presented their own threat, and that one night while we're on turtle patrol, it's New Year's night, actually. We were there over New Year's. I'm walking the beach with a guy who luckily was a Vietnam vet, because I don't know that I would have recognized the sound of incoming gunfire as quickly as he did. But we're walking along and he suddenly grabbed me, threw me behind a rock. And I, got my cameras on and everything. I'm like, hey, what are you doing? He's like, stay down, stay down. And then I could see and hear the little of bullets, shooting up sand down the beach. The Mexican Navy guys got drunk and were just discharging their weapons wherever. All we could do was cower behind our rock till they ran out of ammunition. So, the people who were supposed to be protecting us almost ended up killing us. Luckily, they didn't hit any people or any turtles, but it still was a little scary. The area of Michoacan was just beautiful. The scenery was beautiful and the people were beautiful. And I felt like I was living in a National Geographic article for a couple of weeks, just all of the different variations of life down there, a world that was so different and so beautiful. Through that, I got to meet some Mexican sea turtle scientists who had a sea turtle research station in Baja, California. Baja, California is the Mexican state of California, just south of the United States of California. And in the town of Baja de los Angeles, they have this Mexican government research station, and they get turtles. Local fishermen know to bring an injured turtle there if one gets caught in their nets or whatever. And some that are too badly injured to be released in the wild are kept and studied. And this is me with a local named Luis as we are carrying a turtle to put it on a scale. And so I got to go down and visit these folks quite often. And this is what Baja de los Angeles looks like. This is why I fell in love with the place, is it was just so breathtakingly beautiful and so relaxing to be so far from the world. And I started freelancing for a magazine called Baja Explorer, so I had a good excuse to go down there, basically get a paid vacation. On one of these trips, I ended up rescuing a lost boy and reuniting him with his father. That story is in the book. And that's me with my four-wheel drive on a lonely Baja road. And that's my four-wheel drive. If you don't bring shade to Baja, you're not going to have it because there are no trees. So we'd have to rig up tarps or whatever to actually have shade. And through those sea turtle scientists, they introduced me to lots of characters in Baja. This is one of them. The town of Desenguano, which I love that name, it's Spanish for disillusionment. Desenguano was a copper mining town, and after World War II, the price of copper dropped so precipitously, it was no longer worth mining in this mine. So everybody left town in 1946, all except this gentleman who stayed. He has lived alone in Desenguano for, at that point, 40 some years. He lives in this house made of car parts and twigs and whatever else he can scrounge from the other dilapidated buildings in town. I asked him why he doesn't go to town, and he said, I've been there. And it was such a simple statement. I was like, okay, can't really argue with that. He still goes down in these mines and finds copper and silver, and he finds turquoise and other, semi-precious stones, trades them to the local Indians who make jewelry out of it, trade it back to him, and when passersby come by, he trades them jewelry for coffee and cigarettes and other staples. He also knows how to snare rabbits and eat cactus if it comes to that. But in exchange for a can of Folgers and a carton of Marlboros, I got a beautiful bolo tie, silver and turquoise bolo tie, one of the best trades ever made. One of the other characters I met down there was this guy. He had been looking for years for a lost Spanish gold shipment. In the 1600, tons of Spanish gold, which were being transported from the gold mine to the coast to be shipped back to Spain, disappeared. And no one knows what happened to those tons of gold. It never showed up on the world market. He is convinced that the soldiers who were supposed to be guarding it stole it and buried it or stashed it in a cave or a mine or whatever, intending to come back for it, but never did. Here is his little rock hammer that he would carry around with him. And I love the fact that he carried a pink Hello Kitty backpack as his exploring tool. But he was this mountain goat who would just jump from rock to rock and had no hesitation about going down in these little holes in the ground. And I said to him at some point, aren't you a little worried about, and he goes, what, that I'm going to die? That's going to happen anyway, but I'm going to have a good time anyway. And he was determined to find the Spanish gold mine. Never did. He eventually did die, but not by falling down a shaft. This is a friend of mine coming down a shaft. I was not willing to go down this little hole in the ground. You know, I may be adventuresome, but I'm not stupid. But this ladder looked a little sturdier, so I went down, and then I took that picture of my friend following me down into this gold mine. We did not find any gold. This is me on the set of the TV show that almost happened that Sydney mentioned, Gamers, based on a stage play that I wrote that have been performed all over the United States. And again, the matter of luck thing. In the book, I write about another close call with Hollywood that ended for reasons, you know, beyond my control, of a screenplay that I wrote called China Doll. But this was, our play was optioned by a company called Relativity to be a television series and was cast with geek stars from The Next Generation, Firefly, a few other geeky shows. But we were in the process of making it when Relativity, this giant company, which had produced big movies like The 300 and The Immortals and Scott Pilgrim versus the World, they were going to branch out into television, and our series was going to be the first series. And then this guy here, our producer, got hit in the head with a golf ball. No, I could not make this up. He wasn't even golfing. He was at a restaurant at a golf course in Thailand when he got hit in the head with a golf ball and had brain damage. So they put the project on hold in hopes he would be able to return to the project. And so for months, we are doing nothing. And then Relativity, this huge company that made millions of dollars, went bankrupt. And then the rights to Gamers were tied up in the bankruptcy court for years until we had them revert to us. And now we can start trying to sell it again after years of this. But that is me on the set of my television show that never happened. Again, sometimes, you know, wrong place, wrong time. When I spoke at Bethel Park High School, I had a slide similar to this of some of the people I've met and things that I've done. That's me with George Takei. That's me with Harry Shum of Glee, with Leslie Jordan of Will and Grace, with Jason Collins, the NBA, with Boo Boo Stewart of Twilight movies, me with Governor Gavin Newsom. That's about 10 or 15 years ago before he was governor, but he just invited me to a reception at the governor's mansion 2 years ago now, because I keep forgetting last year never happened, me with various awards and things. And when I spoke at Bethel Park High School, I showed this slide not to say how great I am, but to show the kids how great you can be if you don't listen to all the people who say you can't. My life, you know, I don't think I'm anybody special, but I have just sought out opportunities to meet people and talk to people. And I have written hundreds more of my blogs that I hope will eventually, you know, get to be published. And I have learned something in the course of my, there it is. Writing all these stories, it gave me something to do, certainly, and entertained me and my friends during COVID lockdown. But I once had somebody say, you collect interesting people the way other people collect interesting stamps. And I said, yes, that is true, but I also think that everybody is interesting if you give them a chance to be, if you're willing to listen to their stories. I've had so many people, total strangers, say, I've never told anyone this before, but, and then they tell me their deepest, darkest secret. Sometimes this isn't a good thing. I was on a long flight with a woman who said that she once led the New York State Police on a high-speed pursuit across the state of New York. When she ran out of gas, she drew down on them with a starter pistol, and they shot her 9 times. And I'm thinking, okay, this lady's crazy and this never happened. Then she pulls down the corner of her shirt and she shows me bullet holes in her shoulder. And then I Googled her when I got home. She really led the New York police on a high-speed pursuit and shot at them with blanks. So it's interesting if you're willing to talk to people. On a flight from Pittsburgh, I sat next to John Sidney McCain IV, the son of Senator McCain, who was then running for president. So that was quite the interesting conversation. If people are willing to talk, I am willing to listen. And during COVID, I realized that we shouldn't take people for granted. We shouldn't take their stories for granted. We all have interesting adventures if you're willing to listen. As far as I know, I am the only one my great uncle John told his World War I stories to. As far as I know, I'm the only one my uncle told his World War II stories to. But I asked in a polite and respectful way, and everybody has an interesting story if you're willing to listen. I lost numerous friends and relatives during COVID, and some to COVID, some to other things. But a friend of mine, just an older gentleman who died of cancer about 2 weeks ago, I was surprised to read in his obituary that he had been a volunteer in the Peace Corps in Iran under the Shah for 2 years, and then had spent time in the Marquesas in the Pacific. And I thought, wow, I wish I had known this. I would have loved to ask him about this. And 2 years ago, 4th of July, because again, last year didn't happen, I was at a 4th of July party at a friend who was in his 80s. We both knew he was dying of cancer, and he was just sitting alone in the corner, and everybody was kind of ignoring him. And I went and spent about 3 hours talking to him, knowing it would probably be the last time I ever saw him, but it was one of the most valuable 3-hour periods of my life to hear this man's amazing stories. We all have stories. I saw this sticker up on a wall in my neighborhood and had to take a picture of it because I think we all are living great stories if we are willing to, if we're willing to go a little further and we're willing to listen to each other's stories. So that's the presentation. If anybody has any questions or comments or whatever, I see a comment already. I mentioned this, Bob Krebs. Yes, Roger Goodell graduated from W&J. Yes, another football connection to W&J, the commissioner of the NFL. But yes, any other questions, any other comments?
Thank you so much. And especially that ending about, everyone has a story. Are we willing to ask it? And are we willing to listen? It's very important, especially as you look at other members of your family getting older and aging and wanting to learn about them. I personally wanted to ask you, how does one get ejected from a baseball game for not swearing? I do not know the history of that one, and I don't know if it's a short
Vern Law.
story.
I know you're not a Pittsburgher, but anybody in Pittsburgh knows Vern Law, one of the greatest pirates of all time. But he said that he was known as, his nickname was the Deacon. He wasn't really a deacon, but he was an elder of the Mormon Church, and he was a very religious man. And he was at a game where all of the other players were heckling the umpire after a bad call and shouting obscenities and whatever. And the umpire came over to the dugout and says, "That's it, Law, you're out of here." And Vern said, "What did I do? I didn't say anything." And the umpire said, "I know, but I've got to throw out somebody just for show. And you're not going to pitch today anyway. You should have to listen to all this foul language. Go home to your kids." So nobody else knew why he was getting ejected, but it was a whole symbolic thing. But so, yes, he was the only one on the bench not swearing, so he got thrown out of the game.
That's wonderful. If anyone has any questions, comments, feel free to ask them in the chat. And I am also going to allow you to unmute yourself and start video if you prefer to ask a question that way. Just be warned, you will be recorded.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court. No, that's
no. And I'm going to end our poll and share these results. So majority of people do not have library cards, but that's okay, because I know a majority of people aren't from here on this one. I'm able to see where people, it looks like we have a lot of Steelers fans and followed by the Penguins. I'm disappointed there aren't more Riverhounds fans since I'm a soccer gal.
And I'm disappointed there aren't any Pirates fans, but this year I guess I can't blame them.
Mr. Rogers and Andy Warhol, big fans of them. I just learned today who some of these people. I did not know Jeff Goldblum was from here, nor Mark Cuban, nor Joe Montana, or Michael Keaton.
Oh, well. I will forgive Sydney because she's not a Pittsburgher, but she actually was going to put Penn instead of Penn State in the poll because she did not know the difference, which no one in California does either, between the Ivy League school in Philadelphia and the football school in State College.
I truly learned the error of my ways, but it looks like we are 9-6 Panthers in the audience of individuals who answered them, the
Mhm.
poll. So
Um,
sorry, line buddies. And a lot of you guys. See, everybody says yins, but does anyone really say yins?
yes, I know quite a few people who do, and I did uh, I wrote an article for the Post Gazette about a lawyer who lives here in San Diego. He has the largest mansion in La Jolla, very wealthy man, and he actually taught one of his mimicking birds, because he grew up near the North Park aviary, and he loved the talking birds, so he created his own aviary. He's got a 1-acre aviary on this expensive piece of land overlooking the Pacific, and he actually taught one of the talking birds to say "Yins are all jagoffs." Whenever anybody walks by this bird, it'll just look at them and say "Yins are all jagoffs." And he never warns anybody that this is coming, but he has it. Any Pittsburghers who come to visit, he has to take to the aviary, knowing the bird will do it. And then when you look at the bird just cocks its head and goes, "What?" you know, the
I have a few comments, and Barbara Hall-Felden, Agent 99, is from Bethel Park.
this is
And
true, yes.
a question, what story have you told the most and why?
Wow. I'm not sure that one really stands out that I've told that many more times than others, because I just have such a repertoire of stories. I have had so many weird things happening. I've worked so many weird jobs to support my writing habit, from managing the bookstore to managing a hotel to whatever, that it really depends on the audience and what we're talking about. But I pretty much have a story for anything. In fact, to the point that people will say, "Yes, of course you have a story about Barbara Felden." It's like, yeah, of course I do. But they so yeah, it really depends on, and it depends, whether I'm trying to get a laugh, which I hope some of the stories today got laughs, or inspire people, like some of the traffic school stories were quite inspirational to me. One that I tell in the book that I didn't tell today had a former paramedic in class who said he gave up being a paramedic because he was tired of watching people die in the back of an ambulance, because so many people told them, something as they were dying, when they realized they were dying. Like the one guy said, "The last thing I told my wife this morning was shut up and go to hell. Would you please call her and tell her I'm sorry and I love her and my last thoughts were of her?" And the paramedic said, "I wanted to grab the guy off the gurney and punch him." Like, wait, you've been at work for 8 hours and you didn't have time to make this phone call or leave her a message or anything? Or a guy who hadn't spoken to his son in 17 years asked this paramedic to call his son and tell him he was sorry. He's like, in 17 years, you didn't have time for this, and now it's my responsibility? But he said it occurred to him, what would he do differently if he were dying in the back of an ambulance? Because nobody got up that morning and expected to die on an LA freeway on their way to work that morning. If he were dying in that ambulance, what was his dying wish be, or his dying regret? And he said, that I listened to people die and I didn't want to do it anymore. So he started designing and building his own furniture. And he turned around to the class and said, whoever it is you need to apologize to, whoever it is you need to tell you love them, whatever it is you need to finish, do it, because none of those people thought they were going to die that day. And they always thought to be another day to call their son, and there wasn't. And he had us all, choked up as he's told us, but I've tried to remember that. Like, there's something to this. Nobody expects to die on the LA freeway, but a lot of people do, several a day actually on average. So, so yeah, that was one of the most important one. Oh, I see Marcy's question. Who are you most starstruck by? You'll appreciate this, Marcy, a fellow Penn Stater. I grew up, I had met Mr. Rogers a few times growing up through my father, and I had met, other celebrities and worked with them. So I wasn't really starstruck. And there's a story about how Richard Burton once asked me if I knew who he was because I was so unstarstruck by him. But I was at a Penn State alumni reception at Chasen's Restaurant, which is a famous hangout in Beverly Hills for a lot of movie stars. In fact, Jimmy Stewart was having dinner there that I walked through the lobby to go to the Penn State reception. And I was the only person in the room who recognized Julius Epstein. And I know you're all going, who's Julius Epstein? Which everybody else did as well. Julius Epstein was nominated for Academy Awards in 4 different decades. He wrote Casablanca, among other minor movies. And he was a fellow Penn Stater who was like 90 years old. And I was the only one who recognized him. And one of those things of like everybody else ignoring the old man in the corner. And I went over and talked to him for like 2 hours. But my then girlfriend said, you know, you were a blithering idiot, right? You know, you made a fool of yourself. And I'm replaying some of the things I said and said, yeah, that was stupid. That was stupid. Yeah, that wasn't. But that was it. That was one of the few people that I've ever been like in awe of, because as a writer and somebody who wanted to write screenplays, I was just, kind of blown away by meeting Julius Epstein. Super nice guy. He was willing to tell his Casablanca stories, and it was great. I actually think it was flattering to him, because I said nobody else seemed to care that he was there. And he, how many people recognize writers? One thing about being a writer, if you're, Tom Cruise or Justin Bieber, you have to worry about going to a McDonald's. You go into a McDonald's, you could cause a scene and it could be dangerous and whatever. If people recognize a writer, I mean, how many people would recognize Stephen King if they saw him, or John Grisham? But they're also not going to be jerks about it either. It's not going to get ugly. You're not going to have to send for the riot squad to get you safely out of McDonald's. People would just respectfully come up and go, Mr. King, I love your books. And, that's it. So, but yeah, I think Julius Epstein was actually sort of honored by that.
I love that. I actually have a cardboard cutout of Humphrey Bogart's character, Richard Blaine, at home from Casablanca.
Those of you who follow me on Facebook, I post a lot of pictures of me with my hiking buddy, Zach Bunshaft, and we have known each other for years. And he recently told me that his great-grandfather was Lauren Bacall's first cousin. So he is a first cousin twice removed to Lauren Bacall. And that just blew me away. He had never seen a Lauren Bacall movie. So I have been, making it my goal. The last time we were together, I showed him Key Largo. She's not in Casablanca, but of course that's part of the whole bogey lore. So I showed him Casablanca, The Big Sleep. So I made it my goal to educate him about Lauren Bacall and old movies.
Well, it is 8 o'clock. We have one more question. This will be our last one for this evening. Do you write down details soon after you experience, or are you writing things down from your memory much later?
For the most part, I am writing them down from memory. I did keep a journal for a while. I used to write really long letters to my parents about like when I get back from Baja. In fact, when I got back from the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, I wrote my parents a 52-page single-spaced letter of everything I did in Europe for those weeks. And when my mother died, she still had it. I don't think they ever read it. Who's going to sit down and read 52 pages of somebody else's vacation? But I was so glad to have that. And that served as the basis for a lot of the blogs. I did have the photos, which sometimes I would look at the photos. Yeah, I don't remember the seaplane trip with Rick. I don't remember Joshua Tree with Carl. But in so many other cases, I would just look at this photo and the whole story would come rushing back. I've always been gifted with a good memory. So I've been lucky that way, and I did have some things, to trigger. And when it came to like writing about the '84 Olympics, I still had all my ticket stubs and the order blank for the games that I ordered or events that I ordered. So it was easy to remember those. And then thanks to Googling now, when I couldn't remember like the final score of West Germany versus Denmark in team handball, it was easy enough to find, some of those little factoids. But for the most part, it's just been, having a good memory.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this evening. Do you have any final words you'd like to leave anyone with?
No, I really appreciate you all coming here, and I'm just going to put this up again for those of you who I'm not in touch with. I know I'm in touch with a lot of you. Here is my website, and if you just put Walt at Walter G. Meyer in front of that, you can contact me. That is my email, walt@waltergmeyer.com.
But thank you all for joining us this evening, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you all for coming, and it was great seeing a lot of you, and take care.